Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to take a look at a simplified and more logical way that we can do our processing in Lightroom to ensure that our results are consistent and we don't get bogged down with unnecessary detail. So let's jump in and take a look. So here we are in the Develop panel in Lightroom, and I've been using Lightroom since version 1, which came out in 2007, and at that time there were nowhere near as many controls and options as we have today. And of course over those years more features have been added and the whole development process has become much more complicated. So what we want to do is we want to break this down into all of the tools that we really want to use and set it up for convenience and consistency. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the background for our image preview that we're working on in the Develop module. And if we just right mouse click anywhere in this background area, you can see that I can change that background color anywhere from white all the way through to black and through various mid-tones as well. And you'll see that if I selected white, for instance, the image, because of that contrast with the background, the image is going to look a little brighter. And if you look at it against the black, it's going to look a little bit darker. And so that's a little bit of a perception trick that our brains play on us. And the smart thing to do would just to make that a mid or dark grey so that we've got a fairly consistent background against our images so that we can make a good assessment of the tones and the colours in the image. And the second thing that we would do, and if you haven't already done this, by default when you set up Lightroom, the toolbars are set to a very narrow section on the screen. And if you've got the luxury of a larger monitor, you can expand these toolbar so that you've got much more control. You can see here that each of these sliders has got a fairly limited distance that we can move them through. And it's very hard to get a precise adjustment. But if we move onto this dividing bar, pull that all the way across as far as we can go, we can see now that that slider distance is now probably more than doubled, and we now have much more fine control over how we move these sliders to make the adjustments. So they're just two simple things that we can do to improve our setup of our Develop module. And the other thing you may notice is that I've closed off the left-hand panel here. I'll turn that back on. A lot of the time we don't need to really use anything in the left-hand panel unless of course you're working on presets or you want to go through your history and make some assessments. But a lot of the time you can actually close that off and that gives you a larger preview to be working on. You can also make this bottom panel go away as well if you want to, but for convenience I've left that on. So there's just two little simple things that to remind people that these are ways we can improve the appearance of our working environment so that we've got a better way of working. And next we'll take a look at how we can modify all of those panels on the right hand side to give us the workflow that we want. Now this one I've also covered in previous videos, but it's worth repeating because some people still get themselves tied in knots. By default, when you click on any of these panels to reveal the settings within, it opens up and then scrolls down and then you go into the next panel, and pretty soon you can't find where you started because you've got to scroll up and down to try and find the settings. Well, the easy way to make this much more simple and easier to follow is to use what's called solo mode, and you can enable this by just moving your cursor onto the header bar above any of the sections, right mouse click and just click on solo mode. And what that means is when I click on a panel to open it, all the others close. So I'm in the basic panel now. If I go to the tone curve, it will open and the basic panel will close. So we're not scrolling up and down the screen forever trying to look at the settings that we're trying to find, because that can become really tiresome and people get frustrated with it and then forget about the certain settings that they're trying to accomplish because the whole thing gets too difficult. So solo mode is a really smart way to go. But there are better ways that we can also modify this, because most of you will realize if I close that one up, we've got all of these panels. We're not going to use all of them. In fact, some of them I hardly ever use and others I use all the time. So how can we change the order in which these exist so that we can keep all the ones we want to use together? Well, we can do that by going to right mouse click on any blank space, and we can say customize the develop panel. And here you can see all of the panels that we have available to us, and we can now drag these around to reorder them. And we can also turn off ones that we don't want to use. Now, I'm not going to turn any of these off, but I will change the order, because firstly, the workflow that we're going to recommend involves working between a few of these settings. And of course, we start with the basic panel, the curve panel, but then the calibration panel I use all the time now, and I want to move that further up. So I've just clicked on that, dragged it up, and now it sits below the tone curve. Then I have calibration, then I have the color mixer. I never use the color grading. I find that much too clunky. So I'm going to move that all the way down to the bottom and come back to, I've got the detail panel next. I've got effects. I rarely use the effects, but I'll leave those there. The lens corrections, not collections, corrections. I would probably move that down to just above lens blur. I never use the lens blur. I don't really like that at all. But of course, you can customize this to whichever way suits your working environment or the way that you work. So having done that, I've reordered these panels, and you'll see now that I have to relaunch Lightroom for it to take effect. And these processing panels, or the tabs, will now be in the order that I want them. And we'll go through shortly how I work through this and get the results that I want. So Lightroom's going to relaunch itself, hopefully, and we'll be able to go back in and see how those panels work. Okay, so Lightroom has relaunched, and you'll now see that these panels are now in the order that I adjusted them to. And of course, feel free to put them in the order that you want to use, but just remember, we can change this to suit our own working requirements. So as I said, this is the sort of workflow that I would recommend using, because even Adobe doesn't get it always right, because there are a few things that it suggests we do, and I think that they're not quite in the right order. So the first thing that I would probably do is we go to the profile. Now, there's a lot of talk being made about using the adaptive color profile, and in my experience, it works well in some instances, and in others, it's just totally off the mark. Now, it takes a few seconds to activate, and you can see here we have a slider, and it's done a little bit of adaptive work, and it's boosted contrast and a few other things. In this case, it's not too bad. In other cases, I've found it really to be not so great at all. So I'm going to go back to Adobe Color. That's where I usually would start from, and then I would look at those other things. Now, moving down the panel, Adobe suggests that you want to do at this stage is adjust the white balance. But the problem is, until you've adjusted your tonality in the image, you really can't see if there's a bit of a color cast. And one of the good things about modern digital cameras is that the automatic white balance is now pretty good. It's not perfect. It still gets fooled by some things, but overall, it's not too bad. But if I was to look at this, and there's not a lot of color in this image at this point, if I was to muck around with the white balance, you see that it's pretty hard to find anything that looks right. So I'm just going to go back to our shot, and what we're going to do firstly is adjust our tonality. And you can see here that I've generally got a fairly good exposure. I'm not quite all the way into the brighter parts, and I haven't got any blocked up black areas, so I would probably look at just looking at my tonality, brighten it up a little bit. I can see that my water here is really not doing me any favors. This was photographed on an overcast day, so it's fairly flat lighting. As I said, this is not an image that's what I'd consider to be a world beater. It's just an image that typically we would need to do a bit of work to see if it's worth our while using for any other purpose. So firstly, I'd adjust the white balance, and I'd probably look at tweaking the contrast, bearing in mind if I boost the contrast too far, I'm going to lose detail in some of these darker areas. So I'd be fairly mindful of just looking at these, and this is where the histogram is your friend. You can see where these tonal ranges are going. And then I might want to boost the shadow detail a little bit, and these are all just global adjustments. I'm just trying to get it broadly in the right spectrum. And then generally I would apply a little bit of texture globally and a little bit of clarity, and of course we can apply those selectively later on if we want to. There's no need for dehaze, even though that it was a fairly hazy day. You can see what happens when I use dehaze. It really boosts things up. It's not really something I'd use on this type of image. And then we can look at the vibrance and the saturation, and you can see here, yeah, that does a bit of a change, but this is really a blunt tool. I wouldn't make any changes here until I go to my next step in the process, which is to look at the calibration slider. I'm going to skip the tone curve at this stage because I could play around with the tone curve and just get what I would like with it, but I can always come back to that later. Let's just go down to the calibration, because this is an area where a lot of people skip past this and don't realize the power of the calibration and the color mixer, because this can really boost the tones and colors in an image. And what we would look at, make sure you're on the current version of the process, and if you're not, just click on that and make sure that you are using the current version. And what I'm going to do here, I'm not going to look at changing the hue of any of those primary colors at this point, because that's a really blunt tool. We can do this much better in the color mixer. And what I would do initially is look at moving the slider, and I can go all the way either way. Now you'll see here I'm looking at the blue primary, and if I boost that blue primary all the way up, you'll see that it's really made a big difference to the reds. So don't automatically assume that because you're looking at the blue primary, you're just affecting the blues in the image. So I'm going to boost that up a little bit. Then I'd look at the green primary again. Look at that. It has an effect on different areas. And then of course on the red primary, and yeah, it does have a bit of an effect on the reds. And so I can use this, and it's a much better way than using the vibrance slider. I think it gives you more control, and we'll look at another example in a minute where I've used this more effectively. So I've boosted some of the colors. I'm still not happy with that water. We're going to come back and adjust that shortly. But having adjusted these primary colors, or the primary channels, which I find is more effective than vibrance or saturation, the next thing I would come down to is the color mixer. And we've got three different options in the color mixer. We can adjust the hue of each of these color channels, and when we work with these, they're very subtle. It's not like changing the hue in the calibration, or heaven forbid in the white balance. We've also got saturation options and luminance options. So for instance, if I was looking, let's say we've got this bright red area, if I was to look at the saturation of just purely the reds, well obviously if I slide that slider up and down, it's going to affect primarily the reds. It's probably already plenty bright enough. And then of course we've got the oranges. You can see the logo here that's changed, and by fine-tuning these different sliders, I can then work those colors a little more effectively. And of course we can then selectively look at the luminance or the brightness of each of these color channels. So for instance, that red area that I looked at, I could make that much brighter or duller. So again, used with a little bit of discretion, you've got much more control here. So they're the steps that I would initially work through in getting the color and the tonality somewhere near I want it to be. So we've carried out our tonal and color adjustments. We're now at the point where if we need to, we can go back and look at the color balance. Now in this instance I've got the white hull of a boat. I'm going to have a look at that and see what Lightroom thinks of that. If I click on the eyedropper tool and click here, it's warmed the image up a lot more than I think is necessary. It was an overcast day, and I think I'd rather have a little bit of those cooler tones. So I'll go back from custom to as shot, and I'll just marginally warm it up. It only needs a tiny amount to be warmed up. It doesn't need to be much stronger than that. So what we're going to do now is look at those selective adjustments. And to get those selective adjustments, I've previously made all these, and I just need to go back to another version of the image, which I have. I'll just close that panel off again. And what I've done is I've created a couple of masks. So I've made a mask of the water, and you can see here that I've selected a luminance range, which was largely what I wanted, and then I've painted it in. And you'll see probably that I've forgotten this little hole through there, but we're not going to worry about that too much now. And what I've done there with that selection is I've really moved that down. Let's just turn that off for the moment. Because that was so bright, that water, I've darkened it down quite a bit, possibly too much, and just so that we've got a little bit more realistic water, and that looks a lot better. But really what I want to do is emphasize the sailors on these two yachts, and so to do that, what I would do is create a new mask, and the easy way to do that would be a radial gradient, and just click and drag on here, and just move this over so that it covers the two groups of sailors. And really what all I'm going to do now is just to increase the exposure ever so slightly and raise the shadows ever so slightly, just so that we can slightly emphasize the part of the image where these guys are. And so largely that's all we need to do with our image. We can do more things and make more selections selectively. And now what we'll do is have a look at another image where I've done a little bit more work, but essentially the basic steps, go through, get your tonal adjustments, get your color adjustments right. If necessary, change the white balance. And of course, to be able to see where we've come from and where we've arrived at, if we use the backslash key on the keyboard, we can click on that and go back to before and after. In fact, if I go back to this version, that's the original version without anything. In fact, if I even go back to that sort of thing, it's much different. So we've come a long way in processing the image. Let's look at another option, and we'll look at some of the other pointers. So here we have another image. Again, it's not a greatly inspiring image, but it's indicative of what you can do with something that's really not terribly great. This was a castle in Scotland, photographed on a very overcast day. You can see the sky is completely bald. We're pretty much blown out. We've got a little bit of highlight clipping there. What can we do with it? Well, I'm not going to go through all of those steps again because you've seen basically. Let's just have a look at the finished version that I've made, and let's have a look at all of the steps. Now, it might seem like a huge number of steps that we've gone through and to get where we want to, but I've used this backwards and forwards a few times to make this video. But you can see here I've looked at very early in the piece, selecting the sky out and adjusting the tonality of the sky, because that was blowing out the histogram considerably. So I've done that. I've looked at the different colors. I've masked it and inverted it, and then I've gone through my calibration settings and looked at each of those again. I looked at, well, would I correct the verticals? Some people like their buildings to have verticals, but I'm quite happy to have them converging because that's how they look when I'm there. So we can revert to that. And I've played with a whole lot of different things here, and you can see here a lot of little simple steps. But here we are right at the very end, and we can see this was the image I started with. And you'd probably, if you were looking through your collection of images from a trip, you'd probably look at this and say, yeah, probably not worth worrying about. But, you know, with a little bit of work, you can create something that's much more effective. So let's just have a look at what I did with the masks, because initially what I did was I masked the sky, and the adjustment for the sky, you can see, was quite a dramatic drop in exposure. I would have added a little bit of dehaze there as well, just to put a little bit of color back in the sky, and so that's made a substantial difference. And then what I did do then was invert that mask, and you can see now that it's selecting everything but the sky. and with those adjustments I've increased the exposure on the building, increased the contrast, and I've added more. No, I didn't do some clarity and dehaze. I left that as it was. But what I did do was then selectively later on look at the calibration tools. So I've done 2 masks there. I decided that this, if I turn the mask off here, that little old vintage Canon was a little bit too bright, so I did a radial gradient there, darkened that down. I found another area here that was annoyingly on the edge of the frame, darkened that down, and then we came up and looked at the foreground here, which was again a little bit too bright, darkened that down. So with a few selective masks you can really make a big difference. But if we go back, turn the masks off now and go back to look at our calibration sliders, because you'll see here that I've used quite a lot of increased saturation in each of those channels. But then I've come back to the color mixer and I've looked at the luminance of the greens, lightened that up a little bit, but by and large I've taken the saturation down, so I've made it less saturated but a little bit lighter. But then I've looked at a little bit of extra color in the sky and just a tiny little bit of extra color in the oranges, which is what we can see here in the rocks in the foreground of the building. So looking at any image that initially doesn't show much promise, but working through a series of steps, we can really make a huge difference. And the whole point of this exercise is to set this up so that you've got a consistent way of working. We can go through from the basic panel, get those initial tones right, get the tone curve, get the calibration right, and then selectively do the adjustments. Now, what I haven't mentioned here is applying some denoise and sharpening. And I've previously mentioned that Adobe's denoise and sharpening wasn't really up to scratch, so to speak, but now it is with the latest iteration of the upgrades. We have the new denoise feature. Now this image was shot at 100 ISO. I didn't feel that there was any benefit in looking at denoise, but I did apply some sharpening. And of course the important thing with sharpening is to make sure that you've got your masking really only applying to the edges of things. You don't want to sharpen the whole image, because all you're going to do is sharpen the noise in the sky and not apply it to the important areas. So when you're using the amount slider, I've used 58. I would generally use somewhere up to around 60 or so. I keep the radius at 100. I take the detail up fairly high if that's the sort of image I want. And then with the masking, if you hold down the Alt key and move the slider there, you can see here that I've basically, there's no sharpening at all in the sky, and I've restricted it to the edges of things. So if I release that and we can turn this on, we probably need to zoom in. Let's just zoom in on this point. If I click on the eye symbol here, you may be able to see that there's a slight difference. It's not dramatic. The image was pretty sharp to start with, but it's made a very effective difference. So with most images, you can pretty much do everything you want to do in Lightroom, but for more involved images, or where I need to do much more precise masking and maybe a few other tools and tricks, I would then take it into Photoshop. But there you have it. There's my simplified workflow. Customize your work area, keep the background simple and neutrally toned, and work through in a way that makes a lot more sense. So I hope that's useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.